Hey guys, now that the season is over, it is time to do my player ranking for Survivor 49, where in this video, I'll be ranking all 18 players from the season based on how I feel like they played on the season. Again, trying to strip away Edgic and actually looking at the game for once. And I feel like this was a pretty interesting ranking for the most part, where I feel like there were some debatable placements, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 18 people to talk about, and it's wasting more time. Let's get into the video. So starting off at number 18, the person I believe played the worst game on this season was a debate for me. I did go back and forth between these two people, though at number 18, I did decide to go with the first boot, and here we have Nicole. And I don't think Nicole's the worst player in the world, where I don't think she does as much actively wrong as the next person we'll be talking about to get eliminated here. She was simply on the outs from early on, where it didn't seem like she was part of any core alliance, and with her also being seen as a challenge weakness, it just made her a pretty easy first boot on the season. Now aside from that, you can argue that she didn't get the greatest starting tribe, where Jake in particular is someone she didn't have a great relationship with, and she ends up blaming him for putting the target on her back, mixing in the fact that she just wasn't able to build any real game relationships with a lot of the people on the tribe, where even though a lot of people seem to like her on a personal level, it didn't really translate to her being included into many alliances. But even so, I still don't think Nicole's the worst player in the world, despite her being the first boot. But it's for that reason that I have her here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have the second boot on the season, and here we have Annie. And I do think there's a debate for Annie being at the bottom here, as I do think Annie's probably a worse all-around player than Nicole, as we literally see her doing all sorts of mistakes during her boot round, with her acting pretty bossy around camp and really just overestimating her position on the tribe. Though with that said, the reason I went with her above Nicole is she does at least survive a tribal over Nicole, where despite her being the secondary target during that tribal, she does end up surviving that initial round, not to mention the fact that she at least had an alliance with Alex at a point where there was a point where Alex did want to work with her, and while Alex does ultimately flip against her by her boot round, I think the fact that she at least had that in with Alex from a game perspective was at least something to point out here, mixing the fact that she at least survived the tribal over Nicole, to where it's kind of hard for me to have her too much lower than Nicole based on that, outside the fact that she probably did more wrong to cause about her own actual boot. Though at the same time, Annie didn't seem that poised to do well in the season anyway, and I don't know how much potential Annie really has in general, but still, she at least survived around, and it's for the reason that she's here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we are deviating slightly from the boot order here, but still not someone who made it super deep into the season, but at number 16 we do have Matt. And Matt's another person who never survived a tribal, and someone you could debate got swap screwed, where he obviously was swapped into a position where the Heenas were down in numbers, whereas the Ulis had the majority, and through that you can say that he should be a little bit higher on this list, though even aside from that, I feel like his game is not that great beyond that, where even on his original Hina tribe, he was not really that well positioned on that group, where even though he was kind of working with the majority, he was more so on the outskirts than the majority, where I feel like he and Christina were sort of seen as extra numbers for the Steven, MC, and Jason side of things. And I feel like he also really overestimates his position on that tribe, to where he thought that Jason would have been the first boot, where I don't really think that would have been the case based on what we heard from other people. But even so, he probably would have survived over Sophie S had they gone to that first tribal. But then even after the swap, despite him being swapped into a pretty bad position, I still think he had some opportunities that he didn't fully utilize, like potentially picking up Jason and Sophie B, like these two other outsiders, and then also flipping in Jawan, someone he had met on the journey, and also someone who's clearly at the bottom of the Uli power structure. I feel like had he been able to get those pieces together, that he could have made a bigger move on his tribe, or at the very least build enough inroads to ensure that he stays over Jason, where considering that Jason was a much more important piece for the Hina power structure, and was also someone who would have been a bigger threat down the road. I think Matt could have at least tried to pin the target onto Jason over him, but instead he pretty much disavows the anyone but me strategy, as he claims on the show, and through that I feel like he really misses some opportunities to survive this bad spot. So I feel like on the whole, Matt's game is not particularly great, where again, he was already not in a great spot in the original Hina tribe, but then even after the swap, he kind of misses some opportunities. That, and also he doesn't have the greatest read on certain things in the game. I feel like it's kind of hard for me to have Matt too much higher on this list, which is why he's here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we are once again not sticking with the boot order, but moving on to a later boot. But at number 15, we do have Shannon. And Shannon is yet another person who never survives a tribal on this season. And while there are some redeeming qualities to her game, like her being a later boot and also having a decent starting tribe, I still think there's enough wonkiness with her game to where I can't really reward it too highly. Now, like I said, I think she's in a good spot on the original Uli tribe, where she does seem to be working alongside Rizzo, Savannah, and Nate there, and had they gone the tribal early on, she would have been in a good spot there, though they're never really tested there. But then we get to the swap where from that point on in the game, she's in a pretty rough spot where she's obviously given a bad swap where the Ulis are down numbers initially. And while we do see her trying to build inroads with the majority there to try to improve her position, it never really feels like she's making much progress, where it feels like a lot of people really see through her and don't really trust her. And at the same time, she also burns her relationship with Sage, where Sage really turns on her. And the fact that Shannon doesn't seem to realize that Sage has flipped on her is not a great sign there. And I feel like she probably would have been voted out of that first SWAT tribe had they ever gone the tribal, but again, they never do. And then we get to the second SWAT tribe, where despite her being in a technical majority, where there are 3 original Ulis in that tribe, she is still voted out unanimously at that tribal with Sage and Jawan flipping. And again, Shannon does not see it coming, which is pretty bad there. So on the whole, Shannon is someone who I think definitely tried to play the game. I feel like we saw her playing pretty hard on her first SWAT tribe, where we definitely saw her trying to play the middle and trying to build all these connections to try to get off the bottom, though it didn't seem to be that effective, where it felt like a lot of people were seeing through her and seeing her as like someone who was playing pretty hard, to where by the end, I can't really have Shannon too much higher, especially when she never survives a tribal either. But again, the fact that she was at least trying to play the game and the fact that she was at least in a good position on her starting tribe was enough to have her here at number 15. And moving on to number 14, and we're moving back now a little bit in the boot order, but at number 14 we have Jeremiah. And obviously Jeremiah ends up in a pretty rough spot with him being on Kelly, which ends up being the disaster tribe of the season, and through that ends up being a relatively early boot here. And I think he's someone who really suffers from that tribe just going to tribal after tribal early on, where despite him having been in an okay position early on, like to where he survives over Nicole and Annie, it's pretty clear that he's not within that core 3 of Jake, Alex, and Sophie B. And at the point where they had to go to yet another tribal, it just made it pretty clear that he was going to be on the outs there. Now you can say that he got unlucky by Jake being medevaced in the sense that it made it less likely that Kelly was going to win another challenge, but also takes away a potential number from him. Though at the same time, I get the sense that he would have been the next boot anyway, as again, I feel like the core 3 was Jake, Alex, and Sophie B, and with Jeremiah being on the outs of that, he probably would have been voted out next anyway, which I think is more so an indication of him just being on a bad starting tribe. And I think we really see that during the last round, where I feel like he had very little room to maneuver, where considering that it was just the final 3 of him, Sophie B, and Alex, and with Alex also having an idol in that spot, it would have been very difficult for Jeremiah to really navigate around that, where considering that he was closer to Sophie B and really wanted to get out Alex, or at least flush his idol, that it would have been near impossible for him to somehow get the votes on Alex without Alex like feeling the need to play his idol there. So either way, it was a pretty tough spot anyway. But regardless, I feel like Jeremiah is an interesting player to assess here, though at the same time, he is still only the 4th boot of the season. And I also feel like even if Jake had not been medevac, and even if Alex had not found the idol, he still probably would have been voted out anyway, as he was just the next on the pecking order. But regardless, there was enough for him to be here at number 14. I'm moving on to number 13, and we have yet another person who was voted out in the pre-merge. But at number 13, we do have Jason. And I feel like out of everyone here, Jason was probably the closest you can say to being swap screwed, in the sense that he was in a good position on his starting tribe, but then being put in a bad position on his swap tribe, and that really leaned to his downfall on his season. Now, like I said, I feel like he was in an interesting spot in the original Hina tribe, where despite him seeming to be on the outs initially, where Matt claims that he would have been the first boot had they gone to the first tribal, I feel like Jason is able to build some solid inroads there with MC due to them being alternates and bonding through that, and also picking up Steven, to where it did seem like Jason was in the core of Hina by the time of the second round at least, and I feel like Jason would have been in a pretty good spot afterwards. Though, like I said, they never go to tribal. But then we get to the swap tribe where, again, he's in a pretty bad spot where he's on the bottom alongside Matt. And I feel like Jason does a good enough job at being in survival mode for that first round, where he's able to pin the votes onto Matt in that spot and really build enough roads to survive for Matt at least. Though with that said, there were definitely people who wanted to target Jason outright, with the likes of Savannah and Sophie B really talking about wanting to target Jason first, but regardless, he's able to survive that first round, but it's not enough to carry over to the second round, where at the point where they lose that second challenge, it was pretty clear that Jason was going to go out there with Savannah and Sophie B really wanting to target him at that point, and he doesn't really have much room to survive there. Now with that said, you can definitely criticize him for being snowed into not using a shot in the dark, and him thinking that he could have gotten Jawan on board to target Rizzo, but at the end of the day, I still feel like Jason was ultimately in an unwinnable position where it definitely felt like it made sense for the Ulis to stick together to target him in that spot, to where I don't really fault Jason too much for his boot round here, where I feel like outside of him getting a bad swap, I don't think there's really that much to really criticize with this game. And I think he was able to build some solid inroads along the way with certain people, but at the end of the day, he is still a pre-merge boot, which is why he is here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have the earliest boot left on the board and the final pre-merge boot, but we do have Jake, who was medevac in the third round of the game, despite him literally being in the center of his tribe at that point. And I do feel like Jake's game, for the most part, is pretty solid considering that context. Where, like I said, I feel like he was very much controlling his tribe for the first 2 rounds of the game, where he had the very close connection with Sophie B and Alex, where both of them were more loyal to him than they were to each other. And I feel like that would have carried through even if he was a medevac, where I feel like had they gone to that next tribal, Jake would have once again been the decision maker in that spot. And just in general, I feel like Jake was in a pretty prime position on his tribe here. Now with that said, I don't necessarily think Jake's the greatest player in the world, and I think a lot of his dominance came simply from the fact that he was the most physical guy on the disaster tribe of his season. And I feel like even if he had stayed in the game, he probably still would have been targeted at some point due to him being a physical threat. And with there also being swaps on the season, there's a good chance he would have been separated from his allies, to where who knows how he would have adapted to that situation and whether he would have been able to maintain the control that he had in the original tribe. So again, I'm not saying Jake would have been like a serious start to win the season even if he had stayed, but at the end of the day, he was still sniped out of the game much earlier than his position would have indicated. And with him having a lot of control on his original tribe up until his medevac, I feel like he played by far the best game out of the pre-mergers here, where considering that I feel like all the pre-mergers here have some pretty serious holes in their game, I feel like the fact that Jake had the least amount of holes while having the most amount of active control on his tribe, I feel like it makes sense to have him as the highest ranked pre-merger, and it's for the reason that he's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and from this point on, every person left here made it to at least the merge phase of the game, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 11, we're actually breaking away from the boot order slightly here, but at number 11, I did decide to go with Alex. And Alex is someone who did get to 9th place on the season, and he did technically survive a bunch of tribals across his season. Though despite that, I don't really find his game that impressive, despite the fact that he faced a lot of adversity here. Where despite him like trying to play the game actively, and despite him like technically being the majority for a lot of his run, I feel like his actual run here is not the most impressive, and I feel like there are some knocks that kind of knock it back down for me. Where early on, he is part of the majority on the original Kelly, where he has the connection to Sophie B and to Jake. He also builds an initial alliance with Annie, and it does seem like he is set up well at first on that tribe, though it does quickly disintegrate as they had to go to tribal after tribal. And while he is part of the initial majority to take out Nicole at that first tribal, he then votes out Annie at the following tribal, which is not great as Annie was a number for him. And I feel like him letting her go essentially forces him to stick with the Sophie B and Jake side, which is also not great as Jake has admitted afterwards that he felt very close to Sophie B, considered her his ride or die, to where I feel like had that been the final 3, I very much think that Alex could have been voted out in that situation there. And as well, he does have an idol to save himself in that situation, it also would have been in a spot to where he would have needed an idol to get through that configuration there. And we also see that during the following round where Jake gets medevac, and then they had to decide between Sophie B and Jeremiah, where we very much see Jeremiah pushing to target Alex in that spot. And I do feel like Alex is very much safe by the fact that he has his idol, where while he didn't have a bad relationship with Sophie B, I do feel like him having an idol in a position to where it's a final 3 and it's very likely that he's going to use it very much tipped the scales in his favor for Sophie B to side with him in that spot. And I do feel like had he not had the idol, then it would have been a bit more difficult for him to actually pull in Sophie B in that spot, as Sophie B also had a pretty good relationship with Jeremiah. So I do feel like at the end of the day, I feel like Alex kind of gets spared by the fact that he has an idol to begin with, and also the fact that Jake got medevac, meaning that we wouldn't not have gotten to that final 3 that I mentioned earlier. But regardless, he does scrape through those tribals, and then after the swap, he is able to do some good work there, where we see him building a good relationship with Christina alongside Shannon, to where he's able to remain pretty safe during that configuration, and it doesn't seem like he would have been voted out had they gone to tribal in that spot. And then even on his second swap tribe, he's also able to remain pretty safe there, where it does seem like Nate would have been voted out over him had they gone to tribal there. So again, I feel like he does some decent work in that swap phase of the game. But then we get to the merge, where at that point things become a bit more hairy, where while he's in the majority to vote out Nate in that spot, he's also unable to really reconnect with Sophie B, and through that he's essentially locked into working with the Hina side of things. And while he is in the initial majority there, he does quickly lose positioning, where he becomes a pretty big target at the final 9 due to him seeming to play the middle, though at the same time I think he was also a more threatening figure from the Hina side of things. And it didn't take that much convincing for Jawan, Sage, and Sophie S to flip over to take him out there, to where he is voted out in a 6-2-1 vote. So on the whole, I feel like Alex's game is not the greatest in the world, where while I think he does some good work in the post-swap phase, also in just surviving the early stages of Kele, I feel like he is also someone who's not really in the driver's seat for a lot of it, or he's not really getting his way many points on the original Kele. And even during the Jeremiah round, it was Sophie B's decision to keep him in the game. And even after the swap, while he was able to integrate with the Hinas, I don't really get the sense that he would have been like in the driver's seat for that either. And then after the merge, I feel like there are some missed opportunities with picking up Sophie B and later able to keep himself safe when he does go out. So I feel like it's for that reason that I can't really have Alex too high, but it was enough to have him here at number 11. And moving on to number 10, and we're moving back now a little bit in the boot order yet again, but we do have Nate, the merge boot of the season. And I feel like Nate's game is fine enough considering his placement here, where it did seem like he was in the majority for most of it. Though with that said, he was still only booted in 11th place here, where I do feel like he does pretty good work early on integrating with the majority on Uli, to the point where he was seen as the leader of the majority alliance on Uli, having a connection with Rizzo and Savannah. He also supposedly had a good relationship with Juwan as well. So where it did seem like he was pretty well situated on the original Uli tribe and would have been in a pretty powerful position had they gone to trouble, but they don't. And that carries over to the swap as well, where he's able to hold on to his fellow allies and is able to hold the numbers there, especially with Jawan being there, someone who should have known he was at the bottom of Uli and clearly had these connections to Matt and Jason that should have made it so that Jawan would have flipped there. But despite that, I do have to give Nate at least a little bit of credit for keeping Jawan in line, where I feel like their relationship definitely prevented Jawan from flipping in that spot, to where he's able to hold the numbers during the Matt and Jason rounds. And while Matt did target him during his boot round, it didn't seem like that had any traction going through. So again, I do have to give Nate some credit there for holding the numbers there. But then he does get a pretty bad second swap where he is the only Uli there. And it did seem like he would have been voted out had they gone to that tribal, but they don't. But then we get to his boot round at the merge, where it all just kind of falls apart, where Jawan and Sage do end up flipping from the Ulis to take him out there, which is obviously not great. And with Nate being seen as the leader there, it just made him a pretty easy person to pin the votes on from the other side. And while I do have to fault Nate for not being able to hold on to Jawan and Sage at that point in the game, it was also in a spot to where I think Jawan and Sage recognized the opportunity to be swing votes here, considering that there was this dynamic of a Hina-Uli war at that point, that they could have profited from playing the middle. So I don't really fault Nate too much for his boot round, where I don't think he makes like a disastrous move that leads to his downfall there. Though at the same time, it did seem like he had kind of run to a head wall at that point in the game, with him clearly being like the most threatening person from the Uli side of things, considering his position as the leader there. And it doesn't seem like a position he was actively trying to maintain as well, where it seemed like he was just naturally seen as a leader to him being a bit on the older side, but also someone who just fit that role a bit more compared to the others. So I do feel like by the end, he was definitely harmed by his perception that elevated his threat level. But I still think Nate played a competent game, all things considered, where I feel like he was in the majority for most of his run up until his boot, and I do think there is some impressive work with him keeping Jawan around during the initial swap at least, though it didn't really hold by the time he went out, and it's for the reason that he's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and this is a placement that I very much debated, and I kind of went back and forth over where to have this exact person, though after thinking about it, I did decide to have Christina here at number 9, and I do feel like Christina's game, considering her placement, is not that great when you really look at it, where while I don't think she's entirely devoid of merit, I feel like considering that she got to the final 5, I feel like she doesn't have that much agency during a lot of her run here, where going to the original Hina, while she was part of that majority group, the sense that I get is that she was on the outskirts of that group, where I very much feel like the core of that was Steven, MC, and Jason, whereas Christina felt like an extra number. Then also there was talk about her potentially being an early boot on that tribe had they gone the tribal, and while I'm not really sure what to make of that, the fact that she was talked about as a potential target is not particularly great, though obviously they never do go to tribal. She does get a pretty good swap that allows her to remain in the majority, which is pretty good, and it does seem like she did good work at building a connection with Alex and Shannon, though at the same time, with Shannon being on the outs, it's unclear whether she would have gotten her way there, and it's unclear whether she would have been able to hold on to that connection, though, again, they also don't go to tribal in that spot, and she's also in the majority on her second swap tribe, where you had Nate as a pretty clear outsider, though at the same time, she also does some pretty sloppy play by proposing to use Sophie S as a decoy target. That gets Sophie S pretty upset. And just in general, Christina does not have a very good relationship with Sophie S on this season. And I feel like the way that she handles her many opportunities is not great, as she just made it very apparent that she just had it out for Sophie S during a lot of the season that made Sophie S less likely to work with her, though again, they don't go to tribal there. And then after the merge, Christina is able to hold the numbers initially, where she's part of that initial group. Though with that said, it didn't seem like she was a major decision maker for that group. It more so felt like she was a number for them. But though with that said, she also had a pretty good relationship with Alex and Steven at that point, to where supposedly they had a final three, and had the Hyenas held the numbers, that she probably would have had a pretty straightforward shot to the end of the season. Though at the same time, like, what's her win equity there, as I feel like Steven probably would be here, but whatever. But they do have the majority initially. Though with that said, she does lose control at the final 9, where at that point, Juwan, Sage, and Sophia's do decide to flip on the Hyenas. And really from that point on in the game, Christina's like on the outs from that point forward, where she obviously loses Alex at the final 9, who was one of her closest allies. At the final 8, she tries to flush Rizzo's idol by having their recruit splitting the votes on Rizzo and Savannah, but is once again thwarted, is on the outs when Juwan goes out, and in the process wastes her idol on Steven, which is obviously not a great look. At the final 7, she does get out Sophie S, though that's in a spot to where Sophie S was a consensus target, not really something that she steered the votes onto. And if anything, she said that she would have rather gotten out Savannah in that spot, so even then, that's not a case of her getting her way. At the final 6, she is once again unsuccessful with getting what she wants, where we do see her and Sage at that point trying to flip Sophie B to their side to flip the game on Rizzo and Savannah, though it's unable to get Sophie B on board. And while Savannah winning immunity didn't help, it seems like she gave up after that point, where her and Sage just decided to vet out Steven at that point, despite the fact that Steven had his block a vote that could have given them the numbers there to at least take out one of Rizzo or Sophie B, though instead they kind of just waved the white flag there. Or I very much felt like they were just hoping that Sophie B would flip at final 5, though again, doesn't really come to that. And again, they do get pretty unlucky with Savannah winning immunity yet again at final 5, though at the same time, by that point she was pretty much cooked, where it didn't seem like her or Sage had much of a chance of staying. And Christina is voted out in that spot, seemingly due to her being the better fire maker between her and Sage, where it seemed like that played a factor in things. Though at the same time, I'm not really sure what her win equity was either, where I don't get the sense that she was that big of a jury threat. And while exit interviews could prove me wrong and show that maybe Christina was his master jury threat, I don't really think a lot of the jury really saw her as the best player on that season, where even though there are people in the jury who liked Christina on a personal level, people like Alex, people like Steven, I'm not that convinced it would have translated to jury votes at the end of the day. Not to mention that she still had a bad relationship with Sophie S, to where I do feel like by the end, Christina would have had a pretty tough time winning the season. And I feel like on the whole, her game itself is not overly impressive, where even though she was in the majority for the first half of the game and had this final 3 with Alex and Steven that would have carried her to the end, I feel like she wasn't really the driver of the alliance when she was in power. And I also don't think that final 3 would have led to her winning either, as I feel like Steven probably wins that final 3. And then in the second half of the game, she's either on the outs, barely surviving, or she's just not getting her way even when she is voting correctly. So I feel like it's for those reasons that I can't really praise Christina's game too highly. It's for the reason that she is here at number 9. I'm moving on to number 8, and we're moving back now into the jury phase of the game, but still someone who I don't really know what to make of their game, all things considered. But at number 8, we do have Juwan, and I think Juwan's game is pretty interesting for the most part, and certainly better than what I thought it was going to be at one point this season. Though with that said, I still think there are plenty of holes to point out here, where early on he's in a pretty rough spot in the original Uli tribe, where it very much feels like he's on the outs of that alongside Sage. And it does seem like he would have been the first to go from Uli had they gone the tribal early on, but they don't. They remain pretty safe there. After the swap, he is in an interesting spot where he is part of a technical majority where the Ulis hold the numbers there. Though despite that, he's on the bottom of the Ulis. But despite that, he has a pretty good relationship with both Matt and Jason, the two Hyenas that came over. And I do feel like there was a possibility that he could have linked up with them, though instead he does decide to vote both of them out, voting out Matt first, followed by Jason, which I do feel like is a mistake on his end, as it does feel like he's enabling a power structure that doesn't benefit him. all while cutting people that, again, were pretty open to working with him. We then get to the second swap where he is seemingly safe at that tribal that they go to, where even though Shannon was targeting him at that point, it did seem like the others were pretty anti-Shannon, and through that he's able to be part of that vote. That's pretty good. And then we get to the merge, where at that point he does decide to flip on Uli, where he and Sage decide to flip to the Hyenas to take out Nate, which is pretty good on his end. And it seems like he's able to avoid most of the blood on his hands afterwards, where it doesn't seem like they blame him that much for flipping in that spot. But then we get to the split tribal where it had seemed like he was more open to flipping on Rizzo at that point, though is kind of thwarted by Savannah coming to their camp. That really made a lot of people gun shy about targeting Rizzo, as the fear was that Savannah was going to vote and potentially have an extra advantage that made targeting Rizzo even more risky than already was, to where they do decide to flip on MC at that point, which again is a pretty unfortunate situation for Jawan there, especially when MC was obviously trying to save him in that spot by telling him about Sophie S's plan to throw a vote onto him. Though with that said, I can at least understand why he wouldn't want to go through a targeting Rizzo there. But then afterwards, we do see him and Sage flip on Alex, the following round, sort of flipping back to the Uli side, which is a questionable move on Jawan's end, as it does seem like Jawan had a good enough relationship with Alex, and we even see on the show that Jawan didn't necessarily want to vote out Alex, but kind of felt like he had to due to, one, the perception that Alex was a messy player, and through that, he felt like he kind of had to flip, but also the fact that Sage and Sophia's forced his hand, where it did seem like they were more sort of the decision makers there, and Jawan just kind of had to go along with it. So again, I do have to criticize Jawan for that. And then we get to his boot round where he and Sage do attempt to flip again to target Savannah in that spot, though even then, Jawan has admitted himself that he didn't really want to flip, how he wanted to at least stick with the Ulis for another round, but felt like he had his hand forced by Sage due to Sage having better connections with that side. Then also with them having their final three with Steven, there was at least a path to the end by sticking with the Hyenas to where, again, I do have to fault Jawan for like not really getting his way there, and also like him not really like doing what was in his best interest. Though they do, again, flip ultimately to try to target Savannah, only for Sophie has to flip and taking him out in the process. So on the whole, it is a pretty turbulent game where on one hand, there is his impressive element to Jawan and the fact that he was willing to flip at a point, as we see him flipping during the post-merge to weaken the Uli power structure, but at the same time trying to play in the middle. But at the same time, I also don't feel like Jawan was necessarily better positioned, where I always felt like Sage and Sophie S were in better positions compared to him, where I feel like other people who were like trying to play the middle, Jawan was probably in the most vulnerable position for a lot of the game. Then also I feel like he doesn't get his way as much as you would think, where even though he is flipping, it feels like he's having his hand forced by other people, whether it's Alex playing poorly or whether it's the likes of Sage or Sophie S, like getting their way more so than him. So I feel like even though he does like play this more dynamic game, I feel like he's not really getting his way as much as I would like. Then also, I do question his win equity as well, where I'm not really sure if he wins if he gets to the end, where I feel like for sure he loses to Steven if he had stuck with the bottom-up alliance, but even beyond that, I do question as well whether Sage would have gotten more of the credit had they gotten to the end. I think even Sophie S probably would have beaten him as well if they'd gotten to the end together. So I feel like that's another issue that I have with this game that makes it pretty hard to assess, though at the same time, I think there are at least some impressive elements to Jawan's game, namely the fact that he at least turned up his game, where there was definitely a point in the season where I thought he was just going to stick by Uli and just be picked off by them. So I do have to at least give him some credit for that. And it was enough to have him here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have the earliest boot left on the board, but we do have MC. And I do feel like MC's game here is also pretty interesting in the sense that it did seem like she was pretty well positioned for a lot of her run up until her boot. And also think there is this element of her getting screwed over in her boot round, where I do feel like she definitely gets unlucky due to that. But I still feel like MC's game, all things considered, is pretty good. Where on the original Hina, it did seem like she was in a pretty decent spot there, where it very much felt like she was in the core of that alongside Steven and Jason, to where she would have been in a pretty powerful position had they gotten the tribal early on. But again, they remain pretty safe there. And that extends to her first swap tribe as well, where she is having a Hina majority and is pretty safe during that stretch, would have been pretty safe there. Now, she does get a pretty bad second swap where she is the only Hina to be swapped into an all Uli tribe, though at the same time she had a beware advantage that she would have been able to activate had they actually gone the tribal, to where she probably would have been safe in that spot anyway. And while it would have been an instance of her needing an idol to save herself, it also stems from her having a bad swap. So again, take all that for what you will. but she's able to get to the merge unscathed, and at that point she is part of the initial majority to take out Nate at that first tribal. And while she does waste her idol at that tribal playing it on herself, it's also in a spot to where everyone knew about the idol, where everyone saw her like looking for it, and through that like she would have had this public target on her back, to where I at least understand that logic of it, even though it's not in an ideal circumstance. But we then get to her boot round at the split tribal, where I actually think she does get pretty unlucky by how the actual round plays out. Or for one, you had Savannah winning immunity in a spot to where it did seem like Savannah would have been the clear target had it just been a normal round, but through Savannah winning immunity, that takes that away. Beyond that, you have her ending up on a team with Rizzo, someone who has a very public idol, and through that there is this massive fear about having to like navigate around the idol and having like the numbers to split the vote there. So obviously you have that. But I think the thing that really screws her over and the thing that really pins the target on her back is the fact that Savannah comes to her camp with an advantage. And I think that really scares a lot of people into targeting Rizzo, as the fear of Savannah having an extra vote for Rizzo, not to mention having an advantage that could allow her to potentially block a vote. I think it just made it so that people felt like they couldn't split the vote on Rizzo, and with Rizzo being more likely to play the idol, like it really just caused them to go to the next safest target, that being MC. And I think that really leads to MC's downfall here. Now, obviously, you can point out the fact that MC had leaked this plan to Juwan that Sophie S was going to put a vote onto him in case Rizzo did play his idol, which honestly is not ideal from a pure game perspective, though I do at least understand why MC would do it, as it felt like MC was truly having an out of the game moment with Juwan, with her being worried about all the block players being voted out back to back, and I can at least understand it from MC's point of view there. Though I will criticize her for not actually securing Juwan's vote here, where despite her pleading, Juwan still goes through with voting her out, which is obviously not great considering what she was trying to attempt there. So at the end of the day, I feel like MC is someone who, yeah, despite her being a threat, I do feel like there are a number of really unlucky circumstances that led to her being the target in that specific round. And I feel like outside of that round, I feel like her game is pretty good, where she was in a pretty good spot for a lot of the pre-merge there. And it also seems like she had a lot of respect from the players in the game as well, to where we've heard afterwards that the jury felt like she played a pretty strong game. And I do feel like had she gotten to the end, she would have had a lot of win equity on that season. And I do feel like had like the flips not happened and the Heenas held the numbers, that she probably would have been in an interesting spot there. Now, there is still that worry that she would have been targeted like at the end game due to her being seen as a threat. And I am inclined to think that Steven probably would have gotten his way over her, though I still think her game, considering her placement, was good enough to have her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we are once again sticking with Hina here, but at number 6 we do have Sophie S, who was my winner pick coming into the season, and while my hopes for her actually winning died pretty quickly after the season started based off her edit, and despite there being some worry signs about her game position early on, I feel like she turned out alright as a player, where I feel like by the end of it she was able to turn around to play a somewhat competent game, and also someone who did seem to have some win equity by the end of it. Though with that said, it was definitely a pretty rough start at it, where it seemed like she was left out of the core alliance initially on Hina, where despite her having good relationships with the likes of MC, it didn't translate to her being in the alliance, and it seems like it would have been between her and Christina for who would have been the first boot had they gone to tribal initially, though they're able to remain pretty safe there. After the swap, she remains relatively safe there, largely due to the Hinas having the numbers. Though with that said, it still doesn't seem like she's that integral to that contingent, where it does seem like Steven and MC are still in the driver's seat during a lot of that. And she also seems pretty safe on her second swap tribe, where it does seem like Nate would have been the target there had they gone to the tribal. Though with that said, there was some wonkiness with Christina offering to use Sophie S as a decoy target that made Sophie pretty mad, though that doesn't really come to a head. It's not really until the merge that she does finally attend a tribal, where she is part of that initial majority, where the Hinas come together and they're able to blindside Nate at the first tribal. That's pretty good. We then get to the split tribal, where she is in a more precarious spot, where at that point she is looked at as a secondary target, and there was some talk about targeting Sophie S at that tribal, though that doesn't really come to a head either. She remains pretty safe. Though we then get to the final 9, where she does make a flip, where at that point she does flip to the Uli side to take out Alex and starting to weaken the Hina power structure, which I think for Sophie S probably makes more sense for her, considering that she was at the bottom of Hina and that she would have needed to make a flip at some point anyway. And with Steven being off the board due to him having one immunity, Alex just seemed like the next biggest threat for her to take out from that side, so I do feel like I largely agree with her decision making there. But then we get to the final 8 where she once again decides to flip, this time to take out Jawan. And while I don't disagree with the move, as on paper it seems like it would force Sage to work with her more so than Jawan moving forward, and also allows her to be that central role that Jawan was occupying, I feel like the way that Sophie handles it is not ideal, where she ends up really burning her relationship with Sage in the process and doesn't do the greatest job of damage control. Though to her credit, she does do effective work with other people, where the likes of Steven has talked about how she gave an Oscar-worthy performance when trying to make him feel like she was on board there. Though with that said, by that point, she became a pretty big target to where she is eventually sniped out the final 7 in a unanimous vote. So obviously, I feel like Sophie is someone whose target level did catch up to her by the end of it, and I feel like her flipping just really accelerated that threat level beyond what she could really overcome. Though with that said, I still think Sophie did what she needed to do. I feel like she needed to flip from Hina at some point, considering that she was clearly in the bottom of that power structure. And I also think she seemed like a pretty big threat, where people talked pretty highly about her game afterwards. And I feel like had she gotten to the end, she would have been a pretty interesting jury threat, where I feel like people would have really respected her game had she gotten towards the end. And I also don't disagree with a lot of her decisions in the game. Though with that said, I feel like the way that she handles certain things is not ideal, mixing the fact that she was on the bottom for a decent amount of the game before the merge, and also the fact that she doesn't really manage her threat level the best. I can't really have her too much higher here, but I feel like she played a competent enough game to have her here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we actually have the highest ranked Hina left on the board here, but at number 5, we do have Steven. And to me, I feel like Steven was big power player on the Hina side of things, where it did seem like he had the most amount of control on his side of things. And while he was obviously on the outs towards the end of his run and was eventually taken out, I feel like he was probably the most likely winner by the time of his boot round, where it did seem like he would have had respect there to win a jury vote, even though he probably would have needed to win out if he actually wanted to win at the end. Though with that said, I feel like he played a pretty strong game in the pre-merge, where on the original Hina, he was very much in the center of things, where he was part of the core with him, MC, and Jason. He also had pretty good connections with the likes of Matt and Christina, to where it very much feels like he would have been the decision maker had they gone to Tribal, though they are obviously able to remain pretty safe there. After the swap, he's also in a pretty good spot, where the Hinas have the numbers, and he's once again relatively safe. He still has the likes of MC and Christina's numbers for him, to where he would have been pretty safe there as well, and would have had a lot of influence had they gone to that Tribal. We then get to the second swap tribe, where he is down in numbers, and he is on a tribe that has 3 Ulis compared to him being the only Hina there, though I think he does pretty good work at aligning with Sage and Jawan, building the bottom-up alliance, and through that they're able to flip the vote onto Shannon. So I feel like on the whole, Steven's pre-merge game is pretty solid. We then get to the merge, where his side of things has the numbers initially, where he's able to pull in Sage and Jawan to pull off the Nate blindside. That's pretty good. However, he does get a pretty bad result with the split tribal, where even though he is safe himself from that, he does end up losing MC at the tribal, largely due to things outside his control, with Savannah winning immunity and being able to go over to the other camp and really influencing the vote through that. So I do feel like Steven does get a pretty unlucky outcome based off that, but his game really crumbles at the final 9, where at the final 9, he is blindsided when Alex goes out, and the process loses Sage and Jawan, where they end up flipping to the other side there. That's not particularly great, though to his credit, he's able to at least get back on Jawan and Sage's good graces the following round, where they are voting with him to try to target Savannah, though they do lose out in the vote where Jawan gets sent out instead. And from the final 7 on, he's the biggest target in the game, where at the final 7, he would have been voted out had he not won immunity, though he ends up doing so. They vote out Sophie S. In that final 6, he fails to win immunity, and he does get voted out in the process. Now, obviously, there's the fact that he also has his block of vote that could have made things interesting, though at the same time, they're unable to flip Sophie B when that was a possibility. That, and also Sophie B does attempt to use the knowledge's power against him, which is not great either. And then you have even Christina flipping against him to take him out. So obviously by the end, it did seem like he was a pretty big target. It would have been very difficult for him to get towards the end. And while he does attempt to make a move by flipping Sophie B, it is ultimately unsuccessful and he is voted out there. So he does kind of crumble from the final 9 on, where his side just loses power and is just largely unable to recover. Though with that said, I still think Steven played a pretty solid pre-merge game, and I do think he wins if he gets to the end, where it does seem like the jury did seem relatively high on him, where at least of the final 6, he did seem to be the biggest threat there. So I do feel like Steven still played a pretty competent game, and while it did collapse by the end of it, it was enough to have him here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we essentially have the final 4 of the season, and it's just a matter of ordering them But number 4, we actually have the person who came in 4th place, and that person is Rizzo. And Rizzo's game here is a bit underwhelming in my eyes. Now, obviously, there's the fact that he's supposed to be on 50, which is something that I didn't know about coming into the season. And through that, I was expecting him to play a much bigger game than what he ended up playing here. And while it's not a bad game, I feel like there are definitely missed opportunities and some serious holes within it. Where obviously he is like pretty well positioned early on in the original Uli, where he has a very close bond with Savannah, but he also has a connection to Nate. And he was very much within the power structure on Uli, where he would have been pretty safe there had they gone to tribal early on. After the swap, he is also in a pretty good spot where the Uli still have the numbers. They pick up Sophie B. Though with that said, it did seem like Sophie B was closer to Savannah than she was to him. But regardless, he's able to get through both those tribals, taking out Matt and Jason. Though with that said, Jason was targeting him during that round, which isn't great, but still he had the numbers to stay. We then get to the second swap, which seems good for him on paper in the sense that he gets to stay with Savannah and Sophie B while having an easy Hina there on the outs and MC. Though with that said, had they gone to that tribal, it would have been very complicated for them, as MC would have been able to activate her idol, and through that she would have saved herself, to where I don't really know who MC votes out between them, where for all I know, she could have voted out either Rizzo or Savannah in that spot, but again, they avoid that situation. But then we get to the merge, which is where things get a lot more turbulent for Rizzo's side of things, where right off the bat, they are blindsided at the first round, where they lose Nate. That's pretty bad. At the following round, he's in quite a bit of danger during that split tribal, and he was the initial target there, though I do feel like he gets largely benefited from, one, having an idol that made the majority have to like navigate around that. But then beyond that, he also gets helped by Savannah coming over to their camp, where I feel like that really dissuades the Hinas from putting votes onto him, as they worry that they're not going to have the numbers to split the votes and that it'll be too risky with Savannah's advantage to put votes onto him and have him play the idol. So I'm not really sure how much credit to really give Rizzo for saving himself in that spot, considering that, one, it does seem like a lot of the people on that side were relatively passive and were pretty risk averse when it came to flushing Rizzo's idol. But I think Savannah coming to their camp was another pretty big advantage for him that allowed him to get through that round without having to use his idol. We then get to the final 9, where I do have to give him at least some credit for flipping the vote onto Alex, where it does seem like he was at least somewhat effective at getting the likes of Sage, Jawan, and Sophie S to want to turn on Alex in that spot. Though with that said, I would also give credit to Sophie B for having the information to really allow that move to go through as well. So I do feel like there is some share credit there, though I do have to at least give Rizzo some credit for that. At the final 8, their side is able to once again get a 1-up on them by flipping the vote onto Jawan. Though with that said, I'm not really sure how much credit to give Rizzo in particular for that move, where I do feel like Savannah and Sophie B again do some pretty decent work there. That and also they're also helped by Savannah having her extra vote. And while Rizzo does like try to play a fake idol and once again like uses his idol to like threaten people, I'm not really convinced it's that effective at dissuading people. And just in general, I feel like the fact that Rizzo like really props up him being able to like keep his idol for so much of the post-merge despite it being a very public idol is a pretty overrated aspect to his game, where while I can argue that Rizzo is able to innovate the idol by using the threat of playing the idol in order to really get his way and to dissuade votes, I feel like in reality, a lot of the players didn't really care. And especially after the final 9 round, I feel like a lot of the players outside of his alliance were simply playing around Rizzo, like in his intentions there, where he very much felt like an afterthought to a lot of those people and didn't really see him as that big of a threat. And I think a lot of them were also annoyed by his theatrics at Tribal, where he would play a fake idol during the final 8 round. We see him standing up at the final 6, acting like he was about to play the idol, only to not do so there. And I feel like a lot of them just see it as all style and no substance, where I feel like a lot of players just saw through him and saw him as a joke, someone who really overestimated his abilities. And through that, I feel like Rizzo's someone who, despite him having like this element of having a public idol, I feel like it kind of led to him being seen as a joke. And I feel like by the end, like despite him like getting through a lot of the game, it didn't really feel like he was that big of a threat to win the game. So I do feel like that's a massive issue for him there. But regardless, his side is able to hold the numbers, where at the final 7, they vote out Sophie S. Not really too much difficulty there. Final 6, they vote out Steven. And then we get to the final 5, where he finally does decide to play his idol. Though I do feel like there is a missed opportunity here by him not playing the idol on Christina. Now, he does defend this by saying that Christina was pretty good at fire and that he didn't want to risk going into fire against Christina, considering that Christina did seem to be one of the better fire makers of that final 5, but I still think it was worth the risk of keeping Christina around and hoping that he would be able to put Christina into fire against Savannah and ensure that Savannah gets taken out of the game. And on top of that, I feel like he would have had more win equity at the end against Christina as well, to where I feel like he should have at least tried to risk keeping Christina around in the hopes that he wouldn't go into fire against her and at least try to get Savannah out of Final 4. And also at the same time, try to take out someone like Sophie B at the final 5. But I feel like he kind of plays it safe at that final 5 round and comes into a pretty precarious endgame where I feel like he's pretty unlikely to win against either Savannah or Sophie B at the end. And even then, he gets taken out in fire anyway against Savannah. So I do feel like his endgame here is pretty questionable. And I also think he really overestimates his win equity as well, where he seems pretty confident about his game in his exit interview and acts like he would have won against anyone at the end, where we don't really see that substantiated from any other sources, where I do feel like he would have lost at the end against either Savannah or Sophie B. And I do feel like that kind of makes this game a little bit worse in the sense that he was actively going to the end against people who had a better shot at beating him, but he doesn't really fully read that. And I think he was doing things that he thought was impressing the jury, when in reality, they weren't really impressed at all. So I do feel like at the end of the day, there are plenty of holes with Rizzo's game. Though with that said, he still got to 4th place. He still played a pretty competent game, though I feel like there are enough issues with it to where I do have to leave him behind here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we're at the final 3, so now we got to order them. And this may be a spicy take, though at number 3, I actually have Savannah, the winner of the season. And again, Savannah, when it makes a ton of sense, I feel like the edit was setting up for it for a while. I think with her also being on 50, I was paying attention to her as well a lot alongside Rizzo. And I think similar to Rizzo, I do walk away from her game here pretty disappointed, as I find her winning game here pretty lackluster, and I feel like there are plenty of holes within it. Though with that said, she does have a pretty solid start to her season where she is a part of the original Majority Alliance on Uli and is pretty safe during that stretch, and it's not until the swap that her game really starts, where at that point she is given a pretty good swap with her remaining with her Ulis, and she's also able to build a pretty strong connection with Sophie B that really defines her game moving forward, not to mention that she's part of the majority for both the Matt and Jason rounds. Though with that said, she isn't really getting her way during the Matt round, where it did seem like she wanted to take out Jason first in that spot, recognizing that Jason was more integral to the Hinas compared to Matt, and doesn't really get his way in that spot, though she does later take out Jason at the second tribal that they go to, but still mostly marginal there. We get to the second swap where, similar to Rizzo, she was in that seemingly good spot where she was part of the majority and had MC as the easy target, though things might have gotten complicated had MC been able to play that idol in that spot, and could have put Savannah in a very precarious spot, though it doesn't really come down to that. But then we get to the merge, where her early merge here is pretty rocky, where she is on the outs initially during that first round, where she ends up losing Nate right at the bat. And from that point on in the game, she is looked at as a pretty consistent target on the board, where while she doesn't necessarily need immunities at every single round, there is a lot of talk from the other players about how she is a threat and how they would like to target her, which is obviously a massive issue for her game here. And I think the final 10 round is pretty egregious for her, where she would have been the target there had she not won immunity, though she ends up doing so. Though even then, she's further benefited by being given an advantage and also being able to go over to the other camp during that split tribal, where supposedly Savannah coming over to the other camp played a major role in that actual vote, where initially the plan was to throw votes into Rizzo and to flush his idol, but with Savannah coming over and potentially having this advantage, it really just complicated the majority's plans for that round and really spooked them out of voting for Rizzo out of the fear that Savannah could use her advantage to really screw them over. So I do feel like Savannah is really benefited by the twist for that round that really allowed her to not only be immune, but to come over to the camp and potentially play a role in that tribal. So I do feel like that's something to consider here. Final 9, she wins immunity again, and I'm not 100% sure she needed it, as on one hand, I think she definitely would have been in danger, as we know that the likes of Christina very much was looking at targeting her if she didn't win immunity there. Though on the other hand, I feel like Rizzo and Sophie B did pretty good work with Sage and Jawan and Sophie S in getting them to flip over to where I'm not entirely sure if they would have still flipped had she not won immunity there, though I think Savannah winning immunity made it easier for them to flip over, as it made it so that Sophie B was the only other target from that side of things, and I feel like they were probably less inclined to vote out Sophie B versus if Savannah was on the board there. So again, I'm a bit up in the air over that round, but then we get to the final 8 where she does not win immunity and is targeted from the other side. And while she does have the extra vote that gives them an extra number there to ensure that they get their way, they would have had the numbers anyway, considering that Sophie S was siding with them. And I think Sophie S was certainly incentivized to keep Savannah around as a shield for her. But either way, she does technically survive a vote without immunity. And the same can be said for the final 7, where once again Savannah does not have immunity and once again is able to survive a vote genuinely here. Though with that said, she was still the secondary target, and there was definitely some movement in terms of putting votes into Savannah, though by the end those largely fell through. But regardless, Savannah does at least survive a vote there. That's something. But then we get to the final 6, where I feel like from the final 6 on, Savannah definitely needs immunities to get through the game, where Sophie B has talked about how she would have flipped against Savannah at either the final 6 or final 5 rounds had she not won immunity there, where that alone is pretty bad. But I think what makes it worse is that Savannah didn't even realize that Sophie B was willing to flip against her, where it seemed like Savannah was undyingly loyal to Sophie B and was perfectly happy to go to the end against her, while not realizing that Sophie B didn't reciprocate there. So I do feel like that's pretty bad, the fact that Savannah needed those immunities, and the fact that she was willing to go to the end against Sophie B, despite Sophie B being probably one of her tougher beats on the board here. But through that, she does win Final 6 immunity, gets through that despite having her vote blocked. Final 5, wins immunity again, gets through that round. And then we get to Final 4, where she does not win immunity. And at that point, Sophie B does flip against her to where she goes into fire against Rizzo. She beats Rizzo in fire. And then we get the final tribal, where I feel like Sophie B outperforms her in that spot, where I feel like Sophie B gives a better final tribal performance compared to her. And the fact that she only wins in a 5-2-1 jury vote is not ideal either, especially when it's against Sophie B, someone who, again, she wanted to go to the end with. So I think all things considered, I think Savannah's game is a very flawed one, where I do think there are some impressive elements to her game, like the fact that she was able to win 4 immunity challenges, tying the female record. The fact that she had this pretty solid alliance that was able to get her through a lot of the game. Though with that said, I think she definitely overestimated how willing that alliance was to take her to the end, especially from Sophie B's side of things. And I do think there was at least some impressive maneuvering along the way. Though on the other hand, I really don't like how Savannah was such a big target for so much of the game. The fact that she needed immunity wins at certain points, the fact that she was benefited by the twist at the split tribal that allowed Rizzo to keep his idol in the game for longer, to where they could have used that down the road. The fact that she doesn't even have like that amazing of a social game either, where the likes of Christina didn't really like her that much. Even MC wasn't a big fan of her. And I think that definitely played a factor in the jury vote as well, to where I feel like Savannah's game is definitely a very flawed one. And while I don't think it's the worst winning game in the world, where I would still have her above the likes of Rachel, even above the likes of Kenzie, for instance, if we're comparing her to other New Era winners, I think it's definitely below like a lot of other New Era winners in my eyes. And while I would need to think about her exact placement on the winner ranking, I feel like she's not going to be that high when I really think about it. And I think compared to the top 2, I feel like the top 2 players probably play more smooth games, and I feel like they were probably in better positions for more of the game compared to Savannah, which is why she's here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and obviously we have the 2 runners-up of the season, as I feel like both of them played better games compared to Savannah, and I think by the end of it, I was pretty certain about the order. But number 2, we do have Sage, and I'm a bit surprised that Sage got all the way to the final 3 here, as I was expecting her to be cut before the end. I was expecting her to be like a final juror potentially, or possibly even an earlier boot if we were going earlier in the season. Though by the end, she does end up playing a somewhat impressive game here. Though with that said, it was a pretty rocky start, where early on the original Uli, she was definitely towards the bottom of that, where her and Jawan were outside the core power structure. And while I think Jawan would have been voted out over her had they gone the tribal early on, she still was not in the greatest spot there and was kind of seen as an outcast. Though with that said, her game definitely turns up at the swap, where at the swap, she is swapped with Shannon. And despite them being on the outs initially, where there's a Hina majority there, I do feel like Sage does pretty good work in building connections with the Hinas, to where by the end, the Hinas really come to trust Sage more and want to work with her more so than Shannon, to where she would have stayed over Shannon by the end of it. And on top of that, I feel like she builds pretty good connections with the likes of Steven and Sophie S, to where they become pretty critical allies for her down the road there. On their second swap tribe, she does finally pull the trigger against Shannon and is able to build a connection with Jawan and Steven to build the bottom-up alliance. And again, I feel like Sage does turn up her game during this post-swap phase of the game, which is pretty good. Leading into the merge, where she is pretty effective at saving Steven by flipping to the Hina side and taking out Nate in the process. That's pretty good. And she's also in the majority of the following round to take out MC. Though with that said, there is obviously the whole wonkiness of her wanting to flush Rizzo's idol until the plan later shifted to MC, but still, she is in the majority for that. But then we get to the final 9, where I do think she makes a pretty questionable decision by flipping to take out Alex in that spot, where I don't really feel like it benefits Sage that much to be taking out Alex in that spot, and especially when she's flipping to a pretty solid trio in Rizzo, Savannah, and Sophie B, to where she's not really gaining much favor with them by siding with them. And it also doesn't make much sense when she tries to flip back to the Hinas immediately the following round as well. And while I understand that there are threats that need to be taken out, and Alex is someone you should be taking out before the end anyway, I feel like Sage probably should have waited a little bit more before making that flip and try to weaken that Uli side a bit more. Though with that said, she does at least try to flip back the following round, and in the process she does get blindsided, where she tries to be part of this plan to take out Savannah, but is unsuccessful, and through that she does lose Jawan, who was their closest ally, which is not great. And I think from that point on, she isn't really able to recapture that middle position that well, where, well, she does vote out Sophie as of the final 7, we then get to the final 6, where she and Christina do try to flip over Sophie B at that point, and it does seem at a point that Sophie B was receptive to the flipping, though she is thwarted by Savannah's immunity run that really discourages Sophie B from flipping at that point, and she is essentially forced to vote out Steven at the final 6 there. Final 5 is also not great, where Savannah wins immunity again and is able to survive there over Christina, though at the same time, also not great that Christine and Sage weren't trying to flip the vote onto Sophie B at that point to at least try to set themselves up a bit better for the end game. But regardless, I can at least see why Sage wouldn't want to target Sophie B. And then we get to the final 4, where Sophie B wins immunity and takes her to the end in a position to where it doesn't seem like Sage had much win equity, where it does seem like a lot of the jury just didn't have that much respect for the way that Sage played the game. And I don't think Sage did the greatest job at conveying her intentionality at Final Tribal, where it very much felt like she was hammering in the fact that she was an intelligence analyst and focusing on her life outside the game while not talking as much about her moves within the game, to where I feel like Sage was very unlikely to win the game at that point, though I don't think she really held herself at Final Tribal either. So by the end, I feel like Sage came into the game in a pretty losing spot, and I do think the fact that Sage didn't really have much win equity by the end of it is a major reason why I don't have her number 1 on this list. Then also the fact that she was on the bottom of her original tribe, her also making a pretty questionable move at the Alex round, and her being blindsided at the Juwan round. Obviously, those things also hold her back, and the fact that she just waited too long to try to target Savannah are a major reason why I don't have her higher in the list, but I still think she played a competent enough game to where she is here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe played the best game on Survivor 49 is Sophie B. And I know this may be controversial, as I know a lot of people are very down on Sophie B after the season, and particularly after her Knowledge is Power play at the final 6, though I think after seeing how the game has played out, I do think Sophie B edges out Sage in my eyes, to where I do feel like she played the best game by the end of it, where I do feel like she was pretty consistently in the majority during the entire game, and I still think she had at least some shot of winning by the end of it, where early on she is in a pretty good spot in the original Kelly tribe, where despite them being this disaster tribe, she's able to remain pretty safe in that group, where she is able to build a connection with Alex and Jake that's able to keep her in the majority there. And supposedly, Jake was closer to Sophie B than he was to Alex, to where I am inclined to think that had it gone down to the final 3 of Jake, Sophie B, and Alex, that Jake probably would have sided with Sophie B in that situation, to where I do have to give Sophie B some credit for that. But even in the actual scenario where Jake is medevac, Sophie B's able to remain safe there, where at the final 3 tribal with them, Alex, and Jeremiah, the decisions between Jeremiah and Alex, where both Alex and Jeremiah were willing to work with Sophie B in that spot, saw her as their number in that spot, and this is despite Alex having an idol, to where you would think that Jeremiah would try to have a safe foe and take out Sophie B, but despite that, Jeremiah still decided to try to target Alex and somehow try to convince Alex to not play his idol over just taking the safe vote and voting out Sophie B. So I do have to give Sophie B some credit for that there. We then get to the swap, where despite her being the only Kelly on that group, she's able to integrate pretty well there, where she's able to infiltrate the Uli power structure and really build a very tight connection with Savannah and Rizzo that really becomes her core group moving forward. But they're able to be part of the majority, take out both Matt and Jason in that spot, so that's pretty good. We then get to the second swap tribe, which again, pretty complicated situation, but they avoid it. And then we get to the merge where she is obviously on the outs initially, where she is lumped in with the elite group. She is on the outs when Steven goes home. Though despite that, I feel like Sophie B recovers relatively well from this, where in addition to maintaining her core group, she's also able to branch out to the other side and really build connections there, to where supposedly she built an alliance with Sage and Jawan that really plays a role in allowing them to flip over Sage and Jawan to Final 9 to take out Alex and get back into the majority. That's pretty good. Now, yes, she was also the secondary target at the tribal, though even then that's more so a default considering that Savannah had immunity while Rizzo had the idol there. So again, don't really falter too much for being in that position there. And while they're able to hold the numbers of falling around to take out Jawan at the Final 8, we then get to the Final 7 where she is essentially the swing vote, where we do see the two sides debating between taking out Savannah and Sophie S. And we even see Sophie B telling the other side that she is willing to flip against Savannah. And while in hindsight, this was one of the last opportunities to take out Savannah as she does proceed to win Final 6 and Final 5 immunities, I don't entirely fault Sophie B for sticking by Savannah for this round, as had she taken out Savannah, then she would have gone to a Final 6 where she would have had a much tougher time getting to the end, where Savannah was undyingly loyal to Sophie B, to where I don't really fault Sophie B for wanting to keep Savannah around at least for one more round. Though we do get to the Final 6 where at that point she does try to make a flip against Savannah, where she does entertain with the likes of Christina and Sage, that she's willing to work with them to take out Savannah at that point. Though obviously she's thwarted by Savannah winning both Final 6 and Final 5 immunities, which is obviously very unlucky on Sophie B's end that she's unable to take out Savannah at the point where she really wanted to. Though with that said, you also have her Knowledge's Power play at the Final 6, where yeah, it is a mistake for her to not take Rizzo's idol there, as I do feel like she probably would have been better taking the idol versus taking the block vote, which felt like a more marginal move, especially knowing that Christina and Sage ended up voting out Steven anyway, even with the block vote in play. I feel like Sophie B was definitely better off taking the idol, even if she wasn't planning to target Rizzo, though supposedly she felt like she would have needed to vote out Rizzo if she took the idol and didn't really consider the option of just keeping the idol for herself. And while I can argue that Rizzo and Savannah would have been mad at her had she taken the idol, I feel like if she had flipped, then it wouldn't have mattered as much anyway, as she could have just voted out Rizzo at 5, assuming Savannah wins immunity, and then just targeted Savannah at Final 4 anyway, while having Christina as a pretty competent firemaker. So I do feel like by the end, Sophie B definitely misses some opportunities there to take the reins of the game, even with Savannah winning immunity. But then we get to the Final 4 where she finally makes the move against Savannah there and puts her in fire against Rizzo. And again, there was a debate over her putting herself in the fire, as she very much considered that option. And while at the end of the day, I would have had more faith in Sophie B to make a fire against Savannah compared to Rizzo, to where it did seem like she would have been more likely to beat Savannah had she put herself in the fire. I can also see the reason for why she didn't, as she felt like she still had a chance of winning against Savannah even if she did get to the end. And we do literally see that, where she does manage to get 2 jury votes at the end with a 5-2-1 jury vote, and her also having a pretty strong final trial performance, all things considered, to where I would have voted for Sophie B by the end of it. I feel like out of these final 3, she played the best game, all things considered, to where I would have voted for her if I were on the jury, though obviously I'm not. And I do think, despite her having some flaws along the way, I still think Sophie B played the best game on the season, where I feel like she wasn't as reliant on winning immunities compared to Savannah. I feel like she doesn't have as many issues with winning the game at the end compared to Rizzo. And I think she probably still gets a decent amount of credit for certain moves being made by the trio, where I feel like she definitely had plenty of agency within her game, even on her original tribe. I feel like she played pretty well there. So I feel like it's for all those reasons. I feel like Sophie B played the best game on the season, and it's for the reason that she is here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it helps with the channel. Now I will be doing a review to wrap up my coverage of the season, so be on the lookout for that. And then afterwards, I'll be doing some more general content as we get into the off season here, including some 50 stuff that I'll be pretty eager to talk about, but I also have some other fun rankings, so be on the lookout for that. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.